seminar of the Franco-Brazilian Chair of the COPALC. We are very pleased to welcome today and very honored to welcome Clare Anderson team about a very global project on mental health in Guyanese jails. And it's a moment to thank our former participants. It was a real scientific success, and we are going to give you some news in the next weeks to make some report of all this activity, and to keep in touch to think about the next month and the next activities of the COPALC. And it's a moment also to thank our partners of São Paulo University, French Guiana University, and French Consulate in São Paulo, which are the three partners of this chair. We deeply and warmly thanks to all our participants today. It's a very large project and a very large team which is going to share with us their own research tonight. And without waiting more, I'm going to present their project and a bit the history and the role of Clare Anderson in our field of penal colonization. It's very important for us to welcome her, especially because she's key researcher in our field, and we can there her publication, A Global History of Convicts and Penal Colonies in 2019, which was really the base of our or the beginning of our common work in our group. And we are also very pleased to welcome this transnational team, which sounds like our own group between both sides of Atlantic Ocean. So the seminar today, entitled Mental Health, Neurological and Substance Abuse Disorders in Guyana's Jails from 1815 to the present day. It is an interdisciplinary seminar which offers a series of intersectional insights into mental health and substance use among prisoners and the people who work with them in Guyana. It begins with an exploration of the impact of innovations in jail discipline on ideas and experiences of incarceration during the British colonial period, showing that the colonial state used prison as a form of governance and social control, including labor management. It will then argue that the colonial era's creation of a criminal justice system underpins the form and function of incarceration that is still in evidence today. Drawing on in research in archives, colonial and post-colonial, and interviews with prison staff and prisoners, the seminar will move on to reflect on the contemporary challenges posed by deleterious mental health conditions among the prisoner community and their connection to wider societal issues and lived experiences of both staff and inmates. By drawing out key themes on identity politics, religion, race, class, and gender, the seminar is also interested in comparative perspectives on custodial care, medical intervention, mental health awareness, and community services across the Caribbean and in Britain and the United States. This seminar is based on the ongoing collaborative work since 2019 of researchers at the University of Guyana and the University of Leicester in partnership with the Guyana Prison Service. We are welcoming part of the team, but the entire team is composed of Professor Estherine Adams, Queenela Cameron, and Shammane Joseph Jackson of the University of Guyana. And for University of Leicester, Clare Anderson, Tammy Ayres, Emma Battell Lowman, Deborah Toner, and Kristy Warren. So I will let the word to Clare Anderson now, but just to be sure, all the rules of seminar are well known by everybody. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we can pass them into the screen after for a little moment of debate after our colleagues' presentation in the end of the seminar. So please feel free and to intervene and have a conversation with all of us. So thank you for attention, and please, Claire, go for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Samuel, for that very warm welcome. And it's a real honour to be presenting last in this wonderful seminar series that I know so many of us have been enjoying engaging with, usually via the YouTube recordings, which is just such a fabulous service to all of us who are working across different time zones. So thank you so much for the invitation, and it's really great to be here. We are having just a few technical difficulties with our team getting access into the room. So our WhatsApp group is very actively letting us know who's in and who's out, but I'm hoping that during the course of the seminar, as many of us as possible will be engaging. So what we're going to do is myself and my colleague Kristy Warren are going to introduce the sort of broad brush of the project as a means of introducing everybody to the background of what it is that we're trying to do in our research project. As Samuel mentioned, this is a collaboration, a co-created project, and a truly collaborative effort between our institution in Leicester in the UK and the University of Guyana. It's also important to say that we have the full support of the Guyana Prison Service in our work, and we thank and acknowledge the Economic and Social Research Council, the ESRC, who has funded this work under the Global Challenges Research Fund scheme. So let me begin with showing you a map of Guyana's key jail sites. And here you can see marked up the prisons in Guyana, and it notes in particular Lucic Nom and Tammy, the stars on your screen, as constructed since independence in 1966. But as you can see, the other prison sites are all colonial era institutions, and this is very important for our project. We'll come back to that in a bit. Now, the Guyana Prison Service has faced really serious challenges over past decades, including inmate protests and inmate jailbreaks. The most serious of these have been two fires in Georgetown Prison, which is, of course, Georgetown being the capital of Guyana. So the first fire in 2016, the second fire in 2017, and most recently an outbreak at the Lucic Nom holding bay after 1/3 of inmates tested positive for COVID-19. And sadly, 2 prisoners were shot dead during an attempted outbreak. The 2016 fire, which you can see here from a widely circulating photograph, led to the deaths of 17 inmates. And in its aftermath, a government commission was set up. Now, this commission of inquiry was highly critical of the condition of the prisons and of the experience of inmates in Guyana. And it wrote of a plantation mentality of control and contain, meaning that public attitudes in Guyana are highly punitive. And it also critiqued a key legacy of colonial legal practice, the preliminary inquiry, that is to say, the taking of pre-trial written evidence in the presence of witnesses and the accused. And this pre-trial evidence gathering produces delays in trial, and alongside a routine lack of access to bail for quite petty offences like the possession of marijuana, means that a very high proportion of people in Guyana's jails are on remand. They're not even sentenced. And in Georgetown, at the time of the 2016 fire, not only was the prison at a staggering 184% capacity, two-thirds of the prisoners were on remand. Now, in many ways, the Commission of Inquiry, the 2016 Commission of Inquiry's attention to these punitive public attitudes echoed a British report dated 1960, when a man called Oliver Garrett visited Guyana, which was then British Guyana, just before independence. And he wrote in words that are so prescient today: each country gets in the end the prison administration for which it's prepared to pay. That administration is in turn decided by the degree to which the interest of the average citizen has been aroused. While in British Guyana, I sensed that apart from the few who were interested in social work, the average citizen was content so long as prisoners slept soundly in their cells. But if one escaped or any other unpleasant incident occurred, then he became very vocal. When the question of prison treatment was raised as a topic of general conversation, it was closed with the superficial remark that prisoners were better treated inside jail than outside. See, I told you it was prescient. So there was no desire to cooperate, Garrett wrote, with the authorities in the rehabilitation of the prisoner, and there was a bland indifference to the whole subject. It was only when the negative side of prison as a place of punishment and deterrence which was understood. The positive side of training and rehabilitation was ignored. And I'd also like to say Garrett was also concerned by the high number of under trial inmates in the colony, the on remand inmates in the colony. And in 1960, this was at 35%. So not the 66% that we see now, but still a very high proportion. Now, against this background, I've tried to juxtapose the 2016 report against this report on the eve of independence in 1960. Overall, our project is exploring the hypothesis that modern challenges in the jail sector can be located in the past, in the colonial era, and that punishment and incarceration today are manifestations of what, following Walter Mignolo, we might want to call a coloniality of power. This relates in Guyana to the ongoing use of colonial era infrastructure, colonial era routines and rhythms of incarceration, and experiences of prisons, both for inmates and, as Samuel said in his introduction, the people who work with inmates. There's a special focus in our project on mental health, alcohol consumption, and drug use. We're interested not just in inmates, but particularly in frontline officers, many of whom, as you will all be aware, come from the same communities as inmates. So what I'm going to do is give a brief summary of the history of Guyana's prisons, and then, as I mentioned, I'll hand over to our colleague Kristy Warren, who will pick up the narrative for the period since independence in 1966. And then we're going to turn to some reflections from our team members on various themes that are being raised by the work that we're doing, both historically and also now. So let's go back to a historical map. So this shows prisons in British Guyana during the colonial era. And the first thing that will strike you is that there are many more institutions in the colonial era than there are now. If we flip back, we can see that there's been a decrease in the number of institutions quite radically so. Now we've been working with a wide range of archives in piecing together the history of incarceration in British Guyana. And here I salute Shammane Joseph Jackson, Estherine Adams and Kelly Moss in particular for the brilliant work they've been doing in a really fragmented archive. So the kinds of materials we've been working with include correspondence between Georgetown and the Colonial Office in London, annual reports, parliamentary reports, newspaper reports, memoirs, and also locally appointed commissions of inquiry. So if you like, the colonial precursor to the 2016 commission that I just mentioned. And actually, there's a very interesting history to be told of the history of commissions of inquiry in Guyana then and now. Now, the records that we're working with are split across different repositories. So some material is held in the National Archives of Guyana, in Guyana's Parliamentary Library, and in the special collections of the University of Guyana's Library. In the UK, we have other materials in the British Library and the National Archives in London, as well as, for reasons we don't quite understand, the National Library of Scotland. And this kind of piecing together of the records is really is duplicated, if you like, for the period since 1966, when we have, a very similar approach to putting together these diverse sources. Now, as you'll all be aware, Guyana was a British colony beginning in the early 19th century and remained so through to independence in 1966. And imprisonment as a form of punishment was first introduced during the period of occupation by the Dutch in the 17th century. And the Dutch built the first prison in Stabroek in Georgetown in 1812. Stabroek was later renamed Georgetown in 1812. And the Dutch also built a prison in New Amsterdam. Now, the role of these prisons in this early period was initially limited to the confinement of enslaved men and women on remand for criminal offences, owing to slave owners' legal right of punishment on the plantation. So that is to say, they could punish enslaved chattel in situ. It was only for other kinds of criminal offences that enslaved men and women went into prison. And sometimes these prisons held civil prisoners or debtors. Now, after British occupation and during the era of the amelioration of enslavement in the 1820s, the British state began gradually to assume powers of punishment. And the British introduced new innovations, such as a treadmill in New Amsterdam Prison in 1826. And magistrates and the protectors of slaves, so-called, used the treadmill as an alternative to flogging, although flogging did remain in use. Now, these kinds of innovations accelerated following the abolition of slavery in 1834. And here we see a broader transition from enslavement to wage labour. And this has been very well documented by historians in Guyana and the Caribbean more widely. And in this regard, with this transition to wage labour, jails become, again, as Samuel mentioned in his introduction, a key tool of social discipline and labour extraction from the 1830s on. Now, what's particularly important here for the Guyana context, and as is well known, is that following emancipation in 1834, almost 250,000 men, women and children arrived in the colony, mainly from South Asia, but also from China, Madeira and other locations. They were under contracts of indenture. Now, these contracts were tantamount to what have been called penal contracts. That is to say, for breaches of contract, indentured labourers could be punished through fines, flogging, and most significantly, imprisonment with hard labour. And the offences brought under the purview of the state were many, ranging from a lack of cleanliness to adultery, drunkenness, disobedience, refusal to work, and unlawful absence. Now, against the backdrop of these very large social and demographic changes in the colony, excuse me, Britain instigated a new jail building programme in the 1830s and 40s. And this was supported by a rhetoric, an evangelical rhetoric, that promoted incarceration as a means of encouraging reform when it was accompanied by religious instruction and education. And so the British during this period expand New Amsterdam Prison, which, as I mentioned, had been built originally by the Dutch, and they created new wards and cells for solitary confinement. And here we can see a representation of New Amsterdam Prison in 1940. It's actually quite interesting that we lack many visual records of the prisons of Guyana. This is really in common with my findings for other contexts, except for Mazaruni, which I'm going to talk about now. Mazaruni was held up in the British Empire as an example of sort of best practice in incarceration. So just to flip back, during the 1837 and 1838, as well as in enhancing and building on to New Amsterdam, the British construct coastal district prisons, which you can see represented in the map. And most significantly, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor moving, but Mazaruni, which is far upriver in the interior. Now, Mazaruni was opened in 1842, and here you can see this wonderful watercolour which we found in the British Library dated to 1843. Now, in many ways, Mazaruni was modelled on the ideal of Britain's penal colonies in Australia. The idea was that you could remove offenders from their home districts, you could send them far away from corrupting influences and integrate them into a regime of work and reflection. So this is very much the model that Australia moved towards in the 1830s and 40s, the period during which Mazaruni was constructed. Now, what's really interesting, is the number of visual representations that were produced. So this is a lovely lithograph which we found in the Illustrated London News. You can see in the background the buildings. This shows prisoners being marched out to work. And I wanted to show you this. This juxtaposes a photograph on the left, which is dated around 1870, to a picture that we took in Mazaruni in 2020 during a visit there. So you start to see how the genesis of our ideas about the continuity, the importance of the concept of coloniality and understanding infrastructure, colonial infrastructure today. Now, as I mentioned, the first indentured labourers started to arrive in Guyana following abolition. So the first Indian indentured labourers arrived from 1838, and a whole swathe of new prisons then open as a means to enforce labour contracts. So these are these penal contracts I mentioned a moment ago. If you breached your contract, you could be sent to prison. This is really, really punitive method of labour management. So we see institutions established at Fellowship, Micah, and Sudi, specifically built to incarcerate indentured workers. And there were also some prisons that were opened in the mining districts, as you can see in the interior. So these are very, very much modelled on blending penal discipline with labour management. So I want to just talk a little bit about some statistics, just to present a few statistics. So this, again, the work I mentioned that my colleagues Estherine and Kelly and Shammane have done, and post-1966, they've been working with Kristy, who you'll hear from in a moment. We're really interested in looking at a long run of statistics that straddles the colonial and post-colonial era, which isn't often done. And what you can see in this quite simple graph is that, unsurprisingly, we see this massive jump after 1831. This follows emancipation. It's really very straightforward because for the vast majority of infractions, slave owners punished enslaved property on the plantations. There was no need for prisons before then. With emancipation, the state steps in. So we see this jump. It then goes down slightly. Then we see this other big rise following the introduction of indentured labourers into the colony. There's a slight decrease and then a much bigger decrease when, following a commission of inquiry in 1871, there are improved labour laws. So we see a slight decline. And then what we see, and we're working on these figures going forward, we see a much lower percentage of the population incarcerated today. What we've really tried to do, and I think perhaps Kelly can speak about this a bit later with Kristy, we tried to model rates of overcrowding, because our hypothesis is that although by percentage of the population, fewer Guyanese are incarcerated today than they were in the colonial era, prisons are more overcrowded, but it's very difficult to get comparable data to enable us to do that. Now, let's just move on to say something about labour. So I absolutely love this slide. So erected by convict labour, 1876 to 77. This is on one of the stone walls up at Mazaruni. As Mazaruni was further developed, when it was first built, it actually didn't have any kind of fence or wall around it because it was so remote. The idea was that convicts could not escape because they would have nowhere to go. Of course, that proved not to be true, and this wall was built by convicts. So labour is really important. So convicts are themselves employed in the maintenance, the construction of jail buildings and improvements. So, you know, this is mirrored all over the world, not least in Ushuaia, in Argentina, in Latin America, where convicts are central to the jail building programme. They also work as cleaners, nurses, gardeners and cooks. Of greatest significance was outdoor labour on public works. So prisoners work at quarrying, breaking stones, building roads. And in Guyana, of especial significance is the construction and repair of the seawall. So coastal Guyana is below sea level. So a seawall is necessary to keep the sea out. So that's a really important role that prisoners play. A common refrain in the colony is that free labour could not be obtained. But we think it was actually the malleability of prisoners as a coerced workforce which was attractive to government. So prisoners could be moved and deployed, shifted around, and disciplined in a way that was not possible, or not as possible, for free labour. And note also that in Guyana, in British Guyana, prison gangs were available for private hire, and sometimes they supplemented the free labour force on sugar plantations or in timber concessions. And in some cases, we were astonished to find indentured labourers who are or were incarcerated for breach of contract were sentenced to work on plantations. So we found this very interesting indeed. Ideals of reformation were, historically speaking, always cut short by a lack of resources. And by the 1870s and 80s, attempts to educate and rehabilitate prisoners had almost entirely been replaced with a regime of physical and psychological hardship. These included restrictive diets and extensive periods of unproductive labour. So, for example, the use of shot drill, which was literally the moving of big cannonballs around marked up squares, looking sort of like giant chessboards populated by inmates and large cannonballs that they would move from one box to the other in a sort of routine. So completely pointless labour. And as in other British colonies, women prisoners had their hair cut short as a means of humiliation. And the desire here is to create unresisting individuals accustomed to hard labour. Now, in 1933, in a confidential note, the governor of British Guyana, Edward Denham, described prison conditions as a disgrace. And his words reflected larger social antipathy in the colony about improving prison conditions. And it's here that we see the continuities with public opinion in the run-up to independence, as I narrated at the start of this introduction, and into the present day. So what was signalled by the last major commission of inquiry into prisons in Guyana in 2016. So throughout this period, the desire to obtain the maximum amount of free and unskilled labour continued to outweigh calls to rehabilitate prisons. So the rejection, for example, of a colonial era recommendation to relocate Georgetown Prison to the outskirts of the town highlights the government's unwillingness to relinquish this form of labour. You know, frankly speaking, inmates were required on Georgetown streets. And financial constraint was clearly a factor in these limitations, but it's also bound up with a general disregard of prisoners. And I think the point that I really want to stress here before handing over to Kristy is that it can often be very easily said that during the colonial era, the colonies were well run, they were well resourced. And it was with the transition to independence that things became messy and unresourced. And what we really want to do on this project, and have been trying to do in our archival work, is to show that the issues that we see today are a direct consequence of what happened in the colonial period, right from the 19th century through the 1920s, 30s, up to the 1960s. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Kristy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon. Let me just start sharing my screen. I'm going to try my best to pick up where Claire left off, although I'll also be starting with the fire in 2016 before taking a slight step back to think about absences in the post-independence archive. Sorry, one moment. Okay. I hope everyone can see my slides. Yes. Okay, so let me get started. So this is a picture of Georgetown Prison in 2019. So that's 2 years after the 2017 fire, 3 years after the fire that occurred in 2016, which Claire mentioned at the beginning of her talk. In that fire, 17 prisoners died and 8 were injured after a fire spread in the Capital A block of the prison. The setting of this fire had arisen out of prisoners' frustration with structural deficiencies within the prison that included overcrowding, poor sanitation, and an infestation of pests. Also of relevance was that the overcrowding was caused in large part by the length of time individuals were being held on remand before trial. In July of 2017, a fire destroyed the majority of the buildings that stood in the compound of the Georgetown Prison. So importantly, if you look at this bird's eye view image that was shown in a newspaper after the fire, most of the buildings that were destroyed were actually wooden buildings that have been there since the 19th century. 4 prisoners escaped during this event, and 1 prison officer was killed. Over 1,000 people were imprisoned at the time, in a space meant to hold less than 600 people. These events didn't happen in a vacuum, of course. We just spoke about a fire that happened the year before, but in the 2000s alone, there were at least 5 other occasions when fires were set. And as I've learned from one of our colleagues, Melissa Eiffel, before being outlawed, prisoners carried out rooftop protests to express displeasure about the same conditions of confinement and issues with delays in the criminal justice system that would later lead to fires. I have here a graph that I'm about to talk about in a little while, but first some information that connects back to what Claire was saying about availability of records. So most of the research for the 1960s and 90s are still underway. So far, we focused on the nature of juvenile detention at the National Opportunity Corps, which arises out of research conducted by our colleague Queenela Cameron, who is based at the University of Guyana. We've also considered the nature of records and what this means for doing research in this period. In an article I co-wrote with my colleague Dylan Kerrigan, we explored how record keeping and archival practice in Guyana has been impacted by a range of factors, including a lack of resources, interest, and knowledge about the value by those who can effect the greatest change. So critically, this doesn't mean there's a lack of interest overall, but rather that there's been little effort until recently to take a unified approach to change. As a result, both the post-independence archive and more recent records about prisons in Guyana are scattered and fragmented. For instance, Payne's, the former archivist, whose surname was Payne, wrote a prison report, and I found that not in a government collection, but in the Caribbean Research Library, the CRL at the University of Guyana. A number of government-produced reports, including prison and police annual reports that I couldn't find elsewhere, were also located in this collection. So this continues also for thought into the late 20th century, into the 21st century as well. We've had to piece together a series of documents across government departments. So one example is our attempt to locate prison annual returns. Working across 4 sites, the Guyana Prison Service, what was then the Ministry of Public Security and is now the Ministry of Home Affairs, the University of Guyana Library, and the Parliament Library. So far, we've been able to assemble 17 prison annual reports from between 1977 and 2017, and some of these are drafts. This means that for a 40-year period, so far we found less than half of the annual returns that would have been produced. It's very possible that additional records are held in private collections of former employees, which is something we plan to investigate. And of course, we've also been able to draw on other records to gain information about prisons and prisoners. Records that have been produced both by the Guyana Prison Service, other government departments, as well as regional and global organizations. So this includes, for instance, the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, who write up country reports on human rights. The US State Department compiles reports, and the UN has a range of kind of sub-organizations that have reports on human rights and conditions more generally. However, many of these records are also limited or difficult to access, especially under current conditions. So that has meant the most accessible have been from the 21st century because we've been able to find them online. This includes Guyana's Parliament Library, which has digitized a number of records that have come before the assembly there. There's hope that we'll be able to find some of the earlier periods, so the late 60s and the early 70s, that we'll be able to find some information in the UK National Archives, for instance. And we also have used newspaper sources, both that are located in the UK at the British Library and at the National Library of Guyana, where helpfully the librarians have kept records of newspaper articles by themes, which they've cut out, and prisons is one of the themes that they've recorded. So I promised that I would get back to these statistics, but I wanted to give some background on what we've been able to find so far. So as you can see, there was an attempt to try and think about things every 5 years, and that was possible to do using colonial era records, but it's been more difficult to do using the modern records. So you'll see here that the gaps are not kind of as even as that. But what you can see links back to what Claire was saying earlier when she noted that the numbers of prisoners although the numbers of prisoners have reduced as a percentage of the population, that the prison remains a site that is overcrowded. And we can see from this graph that as the numbers of those held on remand for extended periods has risen, so has overcrowding, because the numbers of prisoners held, the average dailies have increased over these time. Overcrowding is also linked to a range of other conditions in the prison, including problems with access to enough food and issues around good hygiene, which we'll explore in a bit more detail very soon. First, we've been talking a lot about Georgetown Prison, and we'll just quickly look at a couple of other prisons. The issues of overcrowding are most pronounced at Georgetown, but it also is seen in other prisons, such as New Amsterdam, which is pictured here. New Amsterdam, most of the buildings are constructed of wood, just like those at Georgetown were, and it was identified as a fire hazard long before independence in 1966. So once again, linking back to the idea that these systemic structural issues in the prisons are rooted in the colonial era. This next slide is showing the conditions inside of New Amsterdam Prison, where we can see crowded living spaces where there isn't really much room to move around, as well as in the second picture, the conditions of the building, where you can see how the upkeep has been a problem. Another prison, which has already been mentioned by Claire, Mazaruni, which we visited when we went there, and to note that these pictures were taken by, I think his name is on the first slide. Let me just go back. Aubrey James, who accompanied us as we visited the prisons. Mazaruni, also, the conditions inside can be very sparse. And the first one is that you can see is a single cell. And the second is the condition of the prison kitchen. The other prisons are Tamari and Lucic Nom, but I won't be speaking about Tamari today. We're going to turn to speak about Lucic Nom, which Claire has also mentioned. Lucic Nom Prison can be found 16 kilometers outside of Georgetown. The main section is formed from an old hospital. It was to Lucic Nom that prisoners were sent after the fire in 2017, where they are still being held in temporary holding bays, which are set up next to the main prison. And that's what this image is showing right here, the outer wall of the holding bay. The UN called for it to be shut down in the autumn of 2017, so a few months after it was opened, due to the inhumane conditions inside. This includes the fact that this section is also overcrowded. It also is because the structures inside the holding bay are temporary, so there are no walls. There are no floors, so they're on the earth, and there is insufficient bedding, often insufficient water, and lack of space to move around. There have been at least two fires in Lucic Nom there were at least two fires in Lucic Nom last year. In July, allegedly in response to the confiscation of marijuana, although it's possible there were other causes. And then again in September, which Claire has already mentioned, when it was announced that a large number of prisoners had been diagnosed with COVID-19. A commission of inquiry was called for by MP Geda Chandran Edmund, but it was denied by the National Assembly. So we can see on the next slide one of the headlines that came out after the Commission of Inquiry was started in 2016. Commissions of inquiry are one of the few ways that we're able to have access to prisoner voices in official records. Of course, it is mitigated, but they are speaking of their experiences and often tell of quite harsh conditions. They describe the prison, this is Georgetown Prison, as a place where, and I quote, roaches, centipedes, lice, and rats flourish, and blocked toilet areas and cells overflow. Furthermore, it was noted that, and I quote, as the prison population increased, internal mobility in the prison decreases. Critically, no commission of inquiry has followed the events that have, so not just the 2020, but also the 2017. At least I've not been able to locate a commission of inquiry. I found reports saying that a commission would not be held in 2017 until all the escapees have been caught. And I've not been able to find additional records as yet. But going back to the 2016 event, as Claire mentioned, shortly before the fire, the prison was overcrowded. There were 979 prisoners held in the prison, which was 448 more men than it was supposed to hold. The commission noted that the overcrowding had led to a reduction in the quality of food served, as the number of meals being prepared was greater than had been budgeted for. The overcrowding also impacted hygiene, creating an environment where epidemics could occur, supposed gangs could take hold, and led to frustration among those who were confined in such conditions. The commission further noted that the number of recidivists had also increased. The following year, when the 2017 fire there was some reflection back to the previous year and questions of what had happened to the recommendations that had been made in the 2016 Commission's report. It was said that over 40 of those recommendations had not been followed due to a lack of resources. And so this once again reflects back to the issues that keep coming up over and over again of overcrowding and alongside it, lack of funding. So thinking about how people navigate this system on a more day-to-day basis, this includes information that we've been able to gather from the media and also was gathered as part of interviews conducted by my colleagues Dylan Kerrigan and Queenela Cameron, who interviewed prisoners in the spring of 2019. Raids of contraband are reported in the local media, and this ranges from weapons to cell phones, SIM cards, homemade alcohol, and drugs. As having phones and connecting to social media are banned, evidence of prisoners posting to Facebook, showing them hanging out with each other or recording themselves holding weapons, have also led to prisoners being reprimanded. Images and videos of participation in other illegal or banned activities, such as human dog fights, have also been made. The images and videos bring attention to the conditions in the prison, both physical, the overcrowding, and mental, frustration, boredom, anger. A recently published working paper that I wrote alongside 3 of my colleagues on the project, Tammy Ayres, Queenela Cameron, and Dylan Kerrigan, explores the use of drugs in prison. Interviews showed that both were used as coping mechanisms. While most of the men talked about cannabis and tobacco making prison life easier, some men also talked about the brewing and drinking of homemade fermented wine, Pen, while they were in prison. Importantly, the men reported that cannabis and tobacco were of a comparable price in prison and were readily available, but that they were reliant on supplies from coming outside. Conversely, those who were drinking alcohol brewed it themselves out of fruit and food scraps in the prison. Cannabis, my colleagues were told by a number of participants, allowed the men to, and I quote, relax, lie down, get some rest. It's also considered that it provided light relief and recreation. It was used for everyday functions, including to manage emotions, as well as coping with conditions of imprisonment. As one interviewee said, it helps me to eat, helps me to rest. Sometimes it helps me to calm down. And one of the things that's been coming out is that it's something that people use to pass time. Due to the lack of services in the prison, most prisoners spend most of the day doing nothing, not being able to move about either with any great amount of, with the lack of space. So these coping mechanisms are things that people have turned to in these conditions. As Clare noted, the issues found in Guyanese prisons have their roots in the colonial era, and as Guyana's prison system continues to attract media attention and the concerns of prison reform and human rights organizations, both locally and internationally, history can be drawn on to highlight continuities in terms of the challenges of managing large numbers of prisoners with limited means, and also with a criminal justice system that leaves so many on remand. It also provides a final sobering conclusion that little has changed in terms of the high rate of imprisonment in Guyana and the detrimental effects of the system has had since the beginning of British rule in 1814. So that is the end of our presentation part, and we'll now we now have some of our other colleagues who will be coming online. This slide that you can see right now is a screenshot of our working paper series, which is available online through the University of Leicester website. We collaborated on these articles, and I referenced a couple of them in my presentation. And we also have a blog, which we've been contributing to sometimes individually, sometimes together. And we also have contributed opinion pieces in the Starbrook News. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my my screen right now. Just waiting for my colleagues to come in.
Thanks very much. So thanks so much, Kristy. So here we have Deborah Toner and Kelly Moss from the team as well. And I'd mentioned some of the work that Kelly's been doing during the presentation. I didn't mention some of the work that Deborah's been doing, and Deborah may well be known to some of you in this group because of her specialism on Mexico, and in particular the history of intoxicants and alcohol in Mexico. So she comes to this group with a lot of expertise. And Deborah, we sort of mentioned really in passing about alcohol and about the use of about substance abuse and alcohol consumption as one of the sort of key foci of the project. And I wondered if you might like to reflect on your larger work on ideas of racial difference, and how colonial ideas about racial difference influence the confinement of substance use and patterns of substance use in British Guyana. And I also wondered whether it could be a good moment for us to bring in some kind of reflections on asylums and the history of the so-called lunatic asylum in the colony, and the relationship between the asylum and the prison. So I'll throw those questions at you if you'd like to pick those up. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Claire. And I think I'll deal with those in reverse order, kind of briefly, to explain to the audience, in addition to working on the history of substance use in the prisons context, we've also been, and I've particularly been looking at the history of Guyana's asylums and how asylums worked alongside the prison system as a means of kind of controlling members of the population deemed unruly, particularly amongst the labouring classes. A bit of background knowledge, I suppose, to start with, is that the British Guyana Lunatic Asylum, the first major such institution of its kind, opened near New Amsterdam, in fact, very close to the New Amsterdam Prison, about which we've heard some things, in 1867, replacing a smaller asylum that has been operating in Georgetown since the early 1840s. And in the early years of its operation, this asylum had a largely custodial approach to managing patients, signalling its similarity in function to the colonies' prisons. And indeed, due to capacity issues in the asylum, where overcrowding was very much part of the same kind of problems as was experienced in colonial prisons, people deemed mentally ill were often commonly confined in the prison system instead of the asylum, so thus kind of creating a cycle of overcrowding between both types of institution. And then in the asylum itself, during the 1860s and 1870s, keeping patients locked in cells for long periods of time was common, as were physical restraints like iron handcuffs and leather straps. Now, there was a concerted attempt to change that custodial approach to managing patients within asylums in the later part of the 19th century, but the importance of work on managing the inmates of the asylum as a form of rehabilitation speaks to ongoing continuities in the way that prisons and asylums worked together. Now, coming then to a set of issues around how things to do with intoxication, alcohol and drug use, and racial concerns come into shaping what went on between the asylum and the prison. One of the things that I've been thinking about is how contemporary medical and psychiatric professionals understood the causes of insanity and criminal insanity in racialized ways. So people like Dr. Robert Grieve, who was the medical superintendent of the British Guyana Lunatic Asylum in the 1880s, wrote extensively about the connections between intemperance or excess in the use of alcohol and drugs and insanity, and usually framed their interpretations through a mixture of ideas about the experience of social dislocation of certain groups of people, but also theories about racial difference. So, for instance, the idea of degeneration, which was, as many of you I'm sure will know, was very influential across Latin America in the late 19th century, as well as in British Guyana and other parts of the Caribbean, were a broad set of ideas about physiological and psychological weaknesses being passed down through the generations in both a biological and a socially acquired sense. And often excessive alcohol consumption and or drug consumption was thought to be a trigger point for that process of degeneration, and also a consequence of the cycle of degeneration, leading to more problems with substance use in the future. And in discussing the number of patients admitted to the asylum in New Amsterdam up to the 1880s, the medical superintendent made a series of observations about the disproportionate admission of certain demographic groups within the population. On the one hand, he noted a large disproportionate admission of migrants as opposed to people who'd been born in British Guyana. So mainly these would have fallen into the category of Asian indentured labourers, but also newly arrived people from migrants from Africa as well. And within the category of migrants, the medical superintendent said that there was actually a disproportionate number of African patients in the asylum and attributed this to racial difference. First, he described this as part of the reaction to being disorientated, having been transplanted from what he called a more savage lifestyle in the African continent to the comparatively higher civilization of the British colony. And then also in terms of susceptibility to mental illness, his hypothesis was that both African and East Indian patients were not likely to suffer from insanity because of the typical experiences of mental strain that caused many of the diagnosis of insanity in Britain and Europe at the time, but because of the alcohol and drug use that was associated with those populations. So I think that's, hopefully that's kind of given you an overview of that, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much for Deborah. That's so interesting and so useful. And I think just to follow on to that, from that, I'd like to turn to Kelly, really, and ask Kelly to perhaps flesh out some of the continuities in prison regulations between the colonial period and today.
Okay, Claire, thank you. Yeah, so I think I'll start from kind of where we first discovered this in an earlier British Academy funded project, which was kind of sort of like a seed corn, a start to this one, where we had a year to work closely with the Guyana Prison Service to really establish the history of Guyana's prison system. So in an earlier visit, I think it had become apparent to Claire that actually they knew very little about the history of the system, and thought that actually it would be quite useful for different reasons, but also for when they were trying to train some of the prison officers so they could better explain some of their questions, and to really sort of help them understand why things were laid out like they were. So as part of this project, we held several workshops in which we looked at the rules and regulations of the prison system from the 19th century, as well as other documents. And within this, we gave them some of the rules from just before independence, so 1957, and then some quite far back, so in the 1870s. And what we found was that most of the jail regulations regarding the treatment of prisoners remain the same as they did prior to Guyana's independence. And although there have been a few tweaks here and there, the majority hadn't altered at all. And this is so... And this wasn't just those from 1957, just prior to independence. This was actually some of the ones from the 1870 booklets that we actually managed to get from the National Archives. And as they were reading them, it wasn't just the fact that the rules were similar, but actually word for word, a lot of the regulations were identical. So I think that was one of the big shocks of the day for them as well as us. So I've got an example of some of the regulations that I can share with you. So in terms of general discipline and control, what we found was that actually a lot in terms of rehabilitation and things like this is very gendered. So for the female prisoners, the regulations state that they shall be given instructions in sewing, washing, first aid, and child welfare. So as I say, this was in some of the 1870 regulations, but then this is also in their current ones today. So yeah, and we actually saw examples of this when we were able to go on our visits, as Claire and Kristy explained earlier, in the female section of New Amsterdam. We could see they had a specific room that was set out for making clothes, and they were very sort of keen and proud to show us what they'd made. And within that, they were also, again, as it says, kind of taught things along the lines of first aid, and child welfare. Other things are then in terms of punishment. So prisoners may be whipped or flogged on the approval of a minister as a disciplinary measure for inciting mutiny or taking part in an assault. Restricted diets as a punishment may be awarded for prison offences such as escape or attempt to escape, destruction of property, malingering, so what they class as feigning illness, and protesting. And then also prisoners on a restricted diet can be placed in solitary confinement without a mattress. And then finally, the officer in charge may, where necessary in the interests of discipline and good order, confine any orderly prisoner to his cell for such period as he may think fit. And again, a lot of these go back to, can be seen in the 1957 Act, which a lot of the prison rules and regulations still now take it from. And then finally, in terms of work, every prisoner required to engage in useful work, but for no more than 10 hours a day, of which we've kind of, it's important to say, although these rules and regulations are there, that this doesn't mean that these are specifically followed. And that's not to say that prisoners are routinely whipped or flogged or placed on restricted diets, or every prisoner is made to engage in useful work. The last one mainly because they don't have the budget or facilities to ensure that would be required to put this in place. So I think for us, I think as in the 19th and early 20th century, much of the prison system practices today are actually still dictated by the system's lack of facilities, lack of budget. So while these things were put in place in the 19th century, they weren't always, these rules and regulations weren't always stuck to, and then similar today. But yeah, so that's a sample anyway of some of the rules and regulations.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That's really, really brilliant. Some of our team members are actually participating via the YouTube channel, and I wonder whether it's possible for us technically to ask them to identify themselves. So I think, is that possible, Samuel?
Yes, it is for sure. Please, you can write on the chat, and we are going to put your interventions on the screen without any difficulty.
So I think hopefully we have
Tammy Ayres,
possibly Emma Battell Lowman maybe here, Estherine.
Tammy Ayres and Estherine Adams. Who are other members of the team?
I think that's who's been able to join us. There've been some technical problems. I'm just checking my chat. So.
And Emma's there.
Great. So I don't know whether any of the hi Emma, whether any of the team members would like to pick up on any of the points that we've been making.
Okay, I have an amount of questions and reflections. If
great, well, why don't you go ahead, and that sounds wonderful.
Yes, so much thanks for all the team. I hope you're getting better, Claire, after this hard cough. And yes, your work shows how much history is really important to deal with contemporary issues. We see in the Guyanese example how much the colonial roots and the abolition times were had so much influences on our nowadays jails, and it really interests me when you spoke about the times of abolition. I am writing something about how abolition was so unaccomplished in French Guyana, about the goal to abolish forms of forced labor and forms of constrained labor, dependencies I think this word dependencies is really important to well understand how much the forms of work and of unfree work are still really existent. And there, in this context, in British Guyana, we see, like, as you showed, a big increasement of imprisonment, because, like, it's I tell me if I'm not right, but like in the French Guyanese process, like quite all the former slaveries are into a status of vagabond. And with their status of vagabond, because they don't have any house, because it's a master's house, because they don't want to keep working into the plantations, they are under a state of illegality, and they are jailed so much and so much. But in French Guyana's system, we have like so much the role and the place of the penal colony, that the common prison, the civil prison, is a bit less important into the local context, because we had like a prison for all empire, of all French empire there. But in Guyanese process, we see how much prison is there, like, to discipline the society after the collapse of the slave system. And I had some interrogation. It's very interesting to see the Lucic Nom site, which is visibly the last prison built in Guyana, the more recent, and how much the security function of the prison is important. Like, you see two big miradors into a very little space. It's very, very uncommon to see, like, in modern prison, this architecture, which is like much more to show than to secure the prison, I think, because it looks like very, very tiny. So I had some questions. Firstly, about, like, the link between the colonization of the Guyanese space, which is like a desert, like French Guyana. Like, you need to put sovereignty of state into the borders, and Claire, into her introduction on her book, explained very well the role, the function of the convicts in this internal colonization. And where, because I tried to identify places in the map, but I don't know so much, like, Guyana geography. And is there a link between these prisons and border building? Is there also like an ethnical and a racial like profile of prisoners, of inmates? I would like to know more about, like, this link between space, population, and prison there in Guyana. And I would like also to know, it's more personal interest, but I would like to know, during the colonial period, where were the guards from? Were they local guards, or were the directors and the officers from Britain? What is this career? And it appeals to me, because I would like also to know, it's a peripheric questions, but what is the place of Guyana into the common social representations in England, in British society? Is it like the green hell, as French Guyana is for France? And that, does it have some influence into, like, the policy of imprisonment too? because like Guyana was chosen to be like a penal colony because of that, because there is no other purpose or no other project for the colony. So what is the project for the Guyanese colony after the slavery? What is the social representation about this colony? And does it have some influence into the prison policy? That's a bit too much, maybe. But thank you so much. And I just want to notice like the presence in the public of colleagues from French Guiana. And I think like in a comparative way, we are seeing there like so much things to deal together and to work together, I think, into the 3 Guianas. And maybe the 5 Guyanas if we are including Portuguese and Spanish one. And it would be a very, very important work. Maybe in a future atlas, we will tell you about that later, but it's a project with the University of São Paulo, a carceral atlas of Latin America, and it would be very interesting to have like this vision of the Guyana plateau and the imprisonment there. So many thanks again, and I'll let you the talk.
Thank you so much for that, Samuel. I'll have a go at sort of tackling some of the different issues that you raised, and then we'll see whether perhaps some of our colleagues want to come in on any of this. So, yeah, it's interesting what you say about French Guiana, because I've done some work on French Guiana myself, and my new book, which will be out next year, has quite a lot on French Guiana. And it's interesting because, of course, French Guiana was the imperial penal colony. The vast majority of the research has been done on Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni and, the infrastructure of transportation, deportation, relegation, as opposed to locally incarcerated people. And in a sense, there are some parallels there with the state of research on Australia, where the large majority of work has been done on the penal colony in Australia, but not the prisons in Australia used to confine locally convicted people. And I think thinking about the points of difference and distinction for the colony of British Guyana, white convicts were never sent to British Guyana. Now, Mazaruni, I'm kind of obsessed by Mazaruni. I think it's the most fascinating place. So your thing is about guards, so you can have your, will allow you to have your interest, Samuel. Mine is definitely Mazaruni. Now, when the governor of British Guyana came up with the plan for Mazaruni, it's my firm belief that it was a direct response to the Molesworth report, which reported on New South Wales in the same period and was firmly anti-transportation. It recommended the abolition of transportation from Britain and Ireland to New South Wales, the Australian penal colony. And so the governor, Henry Light, his first plan for Mazaruni was that it would be a penal colony for white convicts from Britain. But this did not happen. The Legislative Council in British Guyana, the Court of Policy, explicitly stated they did not want Mazaruni or British Guyana to be known as thieves' country or criminals' country, because they believed, rightly I think, that it would discourage emigrants from coming, that it would be tainted by this association with convicts in a way that would be off-putting for free emigrants. And there, of course, we can see that if we think about what happened later in French Guiana, they were probably right. Okay. So once that plan was rejected, it was decided that Mazaruni would be constructed. So it had this really global impetus, this global motivation, but it would only be used for people who were convicted in British Guyana itself. Now that was quite diverse actually, because by this time there were, I mentioned already, there were people who had come from the Portuguese islands, from places like Madeira, also a number of Bajans, so people from Barbados were working, as well as people from India, China, the recently emancipated African descended or Creole population. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting to think about Mazaruni as almost this sort of interstitial carceral site between a penal colony and a prison. And its formal title was Her Majesty's Penal Settlement, Mazaruni, HMPS Mazaruni. And in the whole British Empire, the only parallel institution I've ever found is in Trinidad. There are no other HMPS institutions anywhere, as far as I can discern, apart from in Trinidad, which I think is very interesting. I'm fascinated about what you said about Lusignan and the kind of performative nature of the architecture of Lusignan, but I think perhaps I might invite a colleague, maybe Kristy or Deborah or Kelly, to speak about that, just, you know, our impressions of visiting the site if we have time. One thing to note about the Lusignan site is that after the Georgetown fire, a number of prisoners were transferred to Lusignan, where they're held in huge military-style tent camps. This is known as the Lusignan Holding Bay. It's been condemned by the UN as unfit for habitation. And I think I can speak for all of the team members when we say that going to visit Lusignan was an incredibly difficult and powerful experience because of the conditions we found there, with hundreds of inmates sleeping nose to tail, basically on the floor in these large open tents. So Lusignan is quite a mixed site. In terms of internal colonization, again, you know, I can invite other of my colleagues to speak about that. It is worth mentioning that the border of Guyana is contested. So the border with Venezuela is contested. You'll be aware from living in the region that actually the oil border is contested too right now, with Guyana's discovery of oil. But these interior regions are so remote that convicts were not sent that far. So we have these very remote prisons in the mining districts. That's to do with disciplining the population that's working in the mines. But we don't see something as we saw in French Guiana, with the relegés being sent down to Saint-Jean-du-Maroni or sent down to build railroads to penetrate into the interior. We don't really see that. The Mazaruni site is highly extractive. It's about mining granite. It's about felling timber and processing timber and shipping it up to the coast. But it's not really about moving further inland. And there are also, there were already settled sites in that region. So there's the town of Bartica, where there's also a mission station. And there was also a leper colony at an island called Cow Island, which is just opposite Mazaruni, at the juxtaposition of these rivers. So, you know, as far as we can see, convicts weren't really sent down into the interior, which is, you know, incredibly remote in the way that was the case in French Guiana. I'll just speak quickly about the guards before handing over to others. So now the key personnel came from Britain. It's a different system to the French Empire, where I know staff circulate every 2 or 3 years. I've forgotten, you will of course know, Samuel, but you know, you have a posting, then you move on, you might move somewhere else in Empire, you know, you're circulating around. It's a bit different, but nonetheless, the key personnel are coming from Britain, and commonly they have a prisons background. So we will see people who perhaps have worked in Pentonville or Millbank or some of the big London prisons will go out to Guyana. The most extraordinary example that we found is one of the superintendents of Mazaruni was formerly a superintendent of Norfolk Island in the Pacific. So that's one of the Australian penal colonies in the early 19th century. So that's the most far-flung transfer that we've seen. The guards at the lower T tier are absolutely from the same communities as inmates. So we find the guards on the ground often come from the African Guyanese population. You know, they will be speaking in Creolese with the inmates and so on. So, you know, the lower tier guards are Guyanese. They're not soldiers, they are prisons personnel. And again, that's quite interesting because in some other sites we see soldiers being routinely employed. You know, we see that in the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire too. But this is very much prisons personnel with separate kinds of uniforms and this sense of distinction, which really follows innovations in the prison service via the Home Service in Britain. But perhaps, I don't know whether some of our other colleagues would like to contribute either via the chat from the YouTube channel or directly in the room. But thanks for those points and questions. They're really great.
Since I can see that we're starting to get some quite substantial questions coming through from the audience, Claire. So rather than, I think you've answered those questions really fully, so I'm not going to say any more about that, but I wondered if it's a good time to start taking some of those broader questions.
Yes. We have 3 questions. One from French Guyana, our colleague Gwenaëlle Quist, which is like English teacher in the university, and we have some question from our colleague John Moore, which is like well known into the penal colony field, and from England. So first, the question of Gwenaëlle: what do you prefer, like putting all the questions together and answer globally, or one and by one?
Whichever you prefer.
Maybe I will put the 3, okay, and you will have like a common answer to that. And thank you, Claire, for the lightning of all these debates. Gwenaëlle asked this: with regards to the asylums, were you able to find evidence that in more recent years the balance between the population of prisons and asylums evolved? And John, yes, overcrowding resources have been used to explain prisons' failure across time and place. Doesn't choosing that perspective inevitably lead to the prison being promoted as the solution to its failure? And he completes his own question by this point. My point is that understanding the prison, both now and historically, do we need to stop focusing on its failure and instead explore the ways in which it can be considered as a success?
Kelly, do you want to pick up the point about asylums and the relationship between the prison and the asylums and the use of prisons to incarcerate so-called lunatics and the transfer of prisoners between asylums and prisons? I know that you've done some work on that.
Yeah, thank you. So historically, we've kind of gone through a lot of the sources, and what we found was that actually prisons for a number of years were actually used to house people with mental health difficulties, and what they would do was that they would keep them under observation for a certain period to determine specifically what level of mental, if at all there were any mental health difficulties, were they feigning them, and they had numerous different levels that were either kind of acceptable, that they felt that person could then be kept in prison, or dependent on what scale, that they would then be sent to the asylum. So for a long period, the kind of relationship between the two, they were very connected, and prisons were used for quite a while as somewhere to place people that they felt did have these mental health difficulties. and it wasn't until really that this stopped that they then were specifically sent to the asylums. But there were, even when this rule was brought in, there was still quite a lot of overlap because the asylums just didn't have the space. So a lot of people were still kept in the prisons at the time. So yeah, there was and obviously, of course, the different to today, how they would kind of recognize those mental health problems were very, I think it's difficult for us to relate to, because I mean, terms were used such as weak-minded, feeble-minded, so it's sort of very difficult for us to understand specifically what those problems were and how they were actually kind of determining who actually had mental health problems and who didn't, and how exactly they made up their mind of who went to prison, who went to the asylums. And so yeah, Deborah, you've also looked at the asylums. Did you want to add any more to that?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on a couple of things and stress that it seems clear that there has been an ongoing relationship between the two types of institutions. Another set of materials that I've been looking at is around these Caribbean-wide conferences on mental health that began in the 1950s and carried on through the 1960s and 70s. I'm just looking at my notes from some of those now, and in the 1965 conference, for instance, which was held in Jamaica, one of the major recommendations that came out of that conference was an urgent review of laws, legal procedures, and court-ordered psychiatric admissions to assess two interlinked problems. First, the use of psychiatric wards as substitute prisons in cases of prison overcrowding, and second, a dearth of appropriate care for incarcerated mental health patients. And our impression from, well, certainly others can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression from some of the information we were presented with by the head of the National Psychiatric Hospital when we visited Georgetown in 2019 was that these are ongoing issues. So for instance, they talked about the lack of personnel and resources within the mental health infrastructure system in Guyana that keeps this relationship between imprisonment and mental health treatment kind of ongoing. So for instance, there's one psychiatric hospital in the country which has 180 beds. In addition to that, the main medical hospital, there's one psychiatric ward with 6 beds. And in the whole country, there are 7, or at least this was in 2019, 7 psychiatrists, 10 social workers, 6 psychologists, and 2 health education officers. So in terms of the resources that there are available to deal with these issues, often thinking about a prison system that it should be evident from some of the kind of issues that have been raised around the conditions in the modern prison system. It's a system that creates mental health problems, as well as, you know, people who already might be suffering from mental health problems kind of being bound up in the criminal justice system. So I can't answer your question precisely around the balance of particular numbers at prisons and asylums changing over time. It's clear that there is an ongoing entanglement.
Samuel, shall we move to the next sort of pair of questions from John Moore about failure and overcrowding resources and so on? I mean, I guess for me, and I'm sure that my colleagues will, and particularly Kristy perhaps, whose work has focused especially on the period since the 1960s, since independence in 1966, will have their own views. But I think there are degrees of success and failure, aren't there? And I think having visited Guyana's prisons a lot over a number of years, our Guyana co-investigator on the project, Melissa Eiffel, who's a PBC at the University of Guyana, was actually a former chair of the Prison Service Sentencing Management Board and has also visited Guyana's prisons regularly for a much longer period. The conditions are so challenging that it's difficult to get away from the issue of a lack of resource when we're thinking about creating institutions that meet even the most basic UN agreements as to what the minimum standard for the care of prisoners should be. So I'm finding it quite difficult to get my head round your question for the Guyana context, John. I mean, I know what you're saying in the sense that, you know, you can always direct more resource. You know, there can always be more money thrown at prisons. They can always be better. But in Guyana, the conditions that we're looking at, which, just to reiterate, we believe stem very directly from a lack of investment and resources in the colonial period. It's very difficult to think about, you know, successes in any way. So I can't really get my head around the idea of the prison being promoted as a solution to its failure, because I think that one of the things that we're trying to look at, and we will be exploring in a sort of follow-on project next year, which is a little bit wider in the Caribbean, is about the overuse of sentencing to prison as creating overcrowding. So for us, we're not really promoting prison as a solution. We're trying to promote a decolonization of colonial era practice, which is still ongoing, in order to encourage alternative sentencing, to encourage the prison not being the solution at all. And our colleague Tammy Ayres, who I think is in the audience but not with us in the broadcast room, who works on substance abuse specifically in prisons, you know, there are lots of very interesting initiatives that we can try to put in place to keep people out of prison. So, you know, prison really isn't the solution at all in any way. And our goal on the project is, by really highlighting, in the way that Kelly explained in this early workshop that we did, highlighting that so much infrastructure, so much of the daily rhythms, the routines, the regulations, kind of everything is colonial. It wakes something up and really helps to develop the appetite for reform. And that was certainly our experience in that workshop, which several people who are here were present at. It was really extraordinary. You know, our Guyana Prison Service colleagues just could not believe. They found it incredible that the things that they were actioning on a day-to-day basis had their roots in the emancipation of slaves in the 1830s. It kind of blew all of our minds. And we found this to be a really effective tool for encouraging reform, to stress this. So sorry, that's a really, really long-winded sort of ramble through your point, John. And I don't know, Kristy, if you wanted to come in on this idea of, you know.
I'll just pick up on something that connects the idea of resources with what we were just talking about what happens to people with mental illness in prison. There was a short period in the 70s, maybe late 60s, 70s, when Guyana did have a bit more resources. And there was a policy that people with identifiable diagnosed mental health disorders would not be put in prison, and they weren't there. So this idea of having infrastructure outside of prison as well that is well resourced or properly resourced is important too, so that people are getting the care that they need in spaces that can help them deal with whatever it is that has led them to the courts. So the situation you have now with people with diagnosed mental health disorders, whether they've had it before they came in or some rupture has happened after they entered the system, in which they're being held together in what is known as the chalet, it's not of use to anyone. It's not of use to the person who's been imprisoned, and it's not of use to society more widely, because they're sitting there all day doing nothing. but possibly smoking weed so that they don't feel the effects of passing every single day in a space that is very loud, that destruction is happening by other prisoners, because the day-to-day care is not there. It can't be there because of the lack of resources. So the idea that they're not having any in the chalet, almost no recreation. So the mental health prisoners actually have less access because of the lack of resources. They have the least access to resources. So there's an absence of programs, there's an absence of recreation, there's a TV, but it doesn't always work properly. So you've got this situation which then exasperates already existing conditions in these men. So that's all I would add. And I'm talking, of course, of the part of the prison that has men in it. We haven't really spoken about women prisoners today, or children.
I don't know if there are any other comments or points that we want to explore. Over to you, Samuel.
Maybe it's time to conclude if there is no more question from the chat. 1 hour and 40 is like quite the record of briefness of our seminars, and it's very good to reach this goal in the last one. And I'm really glad we finished our cycle with you, with this feminine team. I didn't notice, but really impressive. And I hope. So last question to conclude. A good question to conclude. What are your future goals into this research? Your future objectives?
Oh no, that's a good question. So we're obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our work, but we're working with an NGO in the country, which is concluding the next round of interviews, which also engages people living around the prison and prisoners' families in thinking about some of the mental health impacts of incarceration, not just on inmates and officers. We've done those interviews ourselves, but also on communities and on prisoner families. So we'll be busily looking and coding and analysing those interviews when they come in. We still very much hope to get out to Guyana next year to do the big stakeholder workshop that we were planning to do. We're also commissioning some work on a radio station. We're going to have some regular slots to try to engage the public, to try to get the public thinking about prisons. You know, the quote I introduced the seminar with around the public think prisons are like hotels is the kind of thing that we hear all the time when we're in Guyana. I mean, we hear it all the time in the UK as well, this idea that prison life is easy. So, you know, we're really trying to engage the general public in our work and in our research findings too. And then finally, apart from the academic work, we're developing the working papers that Kristy had signalled to you. We're really happy if anyone wants to get in touch with us. We can share those with you if you can't find them. And the same goes for our blog. So we're developing some academic papers and a special issue, but we're also writing some training materials on various elements of the project for the Guyana Prison Service. And our hope is that we can train the trainers. So that is to say that we can help prison staff to learn how to use those materials in order to train personnel in some of the key issues and in some of our key findings. So it's very much an academic project, but with a practical sort of policy-oriented intervention as well, which, you know, I think has been very interesting for all of us, for the historians to think more about the present day, but also for our anthropologists, criminologists, political scientists to think about the historical element. I think has been really rewarding for all of us. We've all really, really learned a lot by working in this interdisciplinary way. So yeah, there's a lot planned before we conclude in July 2022.
Please let us know, Claire, and all of you. We will share for sure your next work on our networks, and it's very, very close to the way we worked this year, because with the chair we formed also like a civil servant of Brazilian prisons during an online course. So sharing together about this way of forming penitentiary guards and staff is should be very good in the future too. So congrats for this work. Our work of researcher needs to be like very close to social community and communities. I think it's a sense of what we are all doing there, and I warmly thank you. There is one last question.
Actually, yes, I've been to French Guiana, and I will be coming again in the next couple of years, really as soon as it's possible to travel again. So obviously at the moment it's quite difficult to travel between Europe or the UK and parts of Latin and South America. But yes, it would be really great to be in touch, to talk more and meet more face to face perhaps at that time. So yes, please, we'll stay in touch.
For sure, I will help this beautiful project as Great. I can, and try to be there too. So it's the time to conclude our seminar and our chair. It was a great pleasure doing science this way and putting people together from 3 continents, I think, in our chair, which is quite good. And concluding this way, we'll keep in touch by email to know more about the future of this chair, which may continue next year and also lead to a publication. We are thinking about that. So have a good night, and thank you for all the participants who are in the backstage, because we can't be all together there, but they are still there. Kristy, Kelly, Deborah, and sorry, I need to. Oh, I can't move. I can see who are the two last, and Melissa. And thank you to Dirce, also the colleague from the COPALP, which is leading all the technical staff there. So have a great evening, and see you soon. Thank you again, all of us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.